Welcome back, everybody. I'm Sue Ferguson. I'm the General Manager of Research at the National Centre for Vocational Education Research. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce Ms. Venville, who's a lecturer and Director of Field Education in the Department of Social Work and Social Policy at La Trobe University. Annie has over 25 years of professional expertise in mental health and disability in both government and non-government sectors. And her research has focused on the relationships between mental health issues, disability, disclosure, and educational outcomes. She recently represented the Australian Association of Social Workers at the 2013 National Roundtable on the Mental Health of People with Intellectual Disability, and contributes to several research groups exploring issues relating to service access for marginalised and vulnerable groups. Annie's talking today about some research that she's completed for us. So please welcome Annie.
Of course, by saying that I have over 25 years of experience is a nicer way of saying that I've been around a while, and only just slightly less than Jonathan. But today I am going to take you on a bit of a Women's Weekly discovery tour, which indicates it was a clue to my age, of, in fact, 3 studies. One that we completed just over 2 years ago, 18 months ago, a scoping review that we're in the process of, has just completed, and our most recent study that's being funded by NCVER. So the title of this presentation is Good Intentions Are Not Enough, and that, I'm hoping the sense of that will become clear to you, but as a sector, this sector is characterised by good intentions. It is filled with staff and policies directed to enhancing participation for students with diverse learning needs, and has a long-standing commitment to students deemed disadvantaged for a variety of reasons. But what we come to know is that good intentions are not enough. We need more than that to effect real change. And this, I'm hijacking this a little bit and taking us down the path of considering the supports that we need to provide to students with hidden or non-apparent disabilities. And so the focus of our research has been on students with mental health issues, and more recently students with acquired brain injury. So it fits very nicely with Jonathan's work also. And the reason I'm focusing on this group is that the average age of onset of a mental illness is 18 to 24. You know that, I know that. You also know that that's the peak time that people are embarking on post-secondary education. It's the time that people are making life-changing decisions. And so how best we can support these students is of real issue and interest to us all. So I thought, let's have a look at the current state of play. And we know the current state of play from existing research. So we do know that we have low course completions amongst students amongst the disability cohort in general, but also we have low course completions among students who declare a mental health issue or an acquired brain injury. We have uncertain data sets. NCVER do a marvellous job in providing us with, massive data sets, but when we're looking at the numbers of students with disability, we have to exercise some caution there, because most of those rely on self-disclosure. And we know that many people who experience a mental illness or a mental health issue will elect not to disclose. They will, maybe, disclose a condition that they perceive is less stigmatised. So very often, students with a mental health issue will disclose a physical disability or a medical condition that will allow them to access some supports rather than disclose their mental health issue. There's a lack of clarity in the system about how to access services, what services there are, and of course the big one is we don't really know what works. We've got some ideas, but we do not have any evidence base to support the huge investment of time and money that many VET institutes currently make in supporting students with diverse learning needs. So how do we know this? I thought let's have a talk about the research that we've been doing, and there's 3 projects that we're going to look at briefly today. The first one was the study that my colleague Annette Street and I undertook a little while ago, and that was called Unfinished Business. And that was a study that was designed to investigate both the factors that lead to successful course completion for students, for vocational education and training students experiencing mental health issues. And at the same time, it was designed to explore student and staff perspectives of student disclosure of mental illness in the context of the institution. And so exploring at the same time, what are some of the institutional processes and policies that might mediate upon both of those things. The other study that we'll talk to you about is, facilitating access to post-secondary education for students with acquired brain injury or mental health issues, and that's just a scoping review of the literature that we've completed, so I'll just give you a snapshot of that. And then our current study, and I'm lucky I have our project manager in the room with me, Dr. Lisa Chafee, who could probably answer anything in much more detail than me, around supporting students with disability, and I'll talk with you about that in a minute. So, Unfinished Business, to start with, it was a case study, a qualitative case study, again recognising that the quantitative data that we have at the moment only gives us part of the picture. So we needed to round it out to increase our understanding. So we had 4 research sites. We were amazed at the uptake at the director level, institute director level, to opt into our study. We were welcomed with open arms. That didn't translate necessarily to what happened on the ground, but at the senior level we were embraced. So we had 4 research sites, and we tried to capture sites that represented the diverse characteristics of the ways that VET is delivered in Australia. So remote, inner city, regional and outer metro. And we had three publicly funded TAFEs or VET providers and 1 very big private VET provider opt-in. We had 20 students. We deliberately were seeking students who had disclosed their mental health issue and students who had not disclosed, trying to understand what were the factors that influenced those disclosure decisions for students, and 20 staff, 11 of whom were in teaching-related positions and 9 in specialist support staff positions. And of course, we looked at all of the publicly available information around access, equity, disability, counselling, all the stuff that prospective and current students would have access to. So again, recruitment, just very briefly, we navigated and negotiated local requirements as to how we could access students. There were some unexpected resistance we found, and interestingly to us, the unexpected resistance came from the specialist staff. And naively, I had assumed that this would be a group who would embrace me most, but they didn't. And they were more resistant than were our teachers, and more resistant than were the institute directors to enabling access to students to speak about the factors for success and the factors for things that influence their disclosure. And that was an interesting discovery for us. So two interviews with students, one at the beginning of the academic year, one at the end of the academic year, so as close to either end as possible. We lost contact with 4 of the students during the year, but a remarkable retention rate amongst the students. One interview with students, and then through a survey tool, we sought staff feedback on student recommendations for organisational change. So just thinking about the factors for success, because that was a big thing that we were interested in, at the heart of it was self-reliance. And you can see there that the things that really mattered were being in the right course, having clear goals, attending regularly, receiving feedback, good feedback from teaching staff, but students also saw the importance of timely submission of assessment tasks as well. The opportunity for study support and critically support outside of VET. Now, staff and students were unanimous on these. There was no difference. Where the big difference lay was the place of disclosure of mental health issues. And so what we know is that within the VET sector, disclosure is the start button. Until you hit disclose, nothing much can formally happen. And most previous research has focused on ways to increase student rates of disclosure. And there's some fundamental assumptions made there. And a fundamental assumption is that disclosure will enhance the outcome for students, and that the student will feel supported, and that systems will be put in place, and that there will be good outcomes. That's not necessarily what we found or we learned from our students and the staff who participated. And of course, students have different understandings of disclosure. So for students, it's a constant dilemma. It's, as most of you will know, at the point of enrolment, a student is asked to disclose. On the form, you tick. Do you have and depending on the institution, the language is, people use different language, a special condition, a learning need, a mental illness, so it's disability. Language is different, but there's an opportunity for people to opt in and tick a box. For students, it's a constant cost-benefit analysis, and you might just be interested to know that of our 20 students who opted in, at the point of first interview, only 5 of those students had disclosed their mental health issue or their mental illness to their vet provider. That left most who hadn't. So when I think about, for the students, it was often about that the common themes that would emerge were about risk, regret, and recovery. And so if we think about those, just students' voices will say this so much better than mine. So if I think about risk and we listen to the voice of SJ from Site 1, I definitely think that you'd either be looked at like down upon or not trustworthy or not responsible enough. I don't feel that you could get ahead. Regret? When you speak, your words are not yours anymore. They're everybody else's, and they can do whatever they want when they hear them. And recovery. I feel good about achieving without special consideration. Looking back, it has been worth it. These are really common themes. What we did find is that a number of students throughout the year did elect to disclose, but they felt driven to disclose to avoid further failure, or sometimes out of a sense of obligation. They felt that the kindness showed to them by staff deserved some explanation. So they were the common themes that were emerging for us. I think this is useful to listen to Elaine from Site 1, and where he said to us, well, if I say talk openly with my teachers about depression or anything like that, because they're in the industry, I just fear that if one day they are to interview me for a job and, or take part in a project, they'll think, oh, hey, that's the guy who was depressed. He didn't cope with his previous job, so he quit. I just fear that kind of information might escape. I know that this depression I'm going through is just a phase and not something that's going to last forever, so I just want to keep it to myself. I just don't want to be perceived as depressed, as a depressed person, as a sad person. He captures really well the essence of many of the students' perspective, and that was a belief that their mental health issue at the time was both private and transient, and not something that they wished to be defined by. Yet our systems define people. So for many of our students, they did not believe that they warranted special adjustment. They often couldn't think of what difference anything could make. They didn't think that if they got used to getting some adjustment in the vet sector, that would be helpful for them because it wouldn't translate, they believed, into the workforce. When you think about the vet sector and you think about the way we teach in that sector, and that many of our teachers are industry-based, it's a double whammy for students. It's an added risk. So students are often being taught by their potential employer, if not a potential colleague. So again, as Sue was saying earlier, the benefits of that small community, the good, the connectedness, there was also the not so good associated with that as well. The risk of, the loss of a sense of self. So very often for students, non-disclosure was around a campaign for the presentation of a better self, the reliable self, the competent self, the self that could transition into the workforce. And I think that when we talk about that, we think, oh yeah, that makes sense, but it doesn't get reflected in our practices. The other interesting thing about that is that there was a great sense of achievement in enabling a domain in one's life to be protected from or quarantined from illness. So if I go to TAFE and you see me as a functioning person, you will, and there's some chance that, what the students were saying, if you see that and you believe that, then maybe I can believe that too. And then my more vulnerable self I can expose elsewhere. But in this part of my life, I need to project my capable self, the self that you might want to employ, the self that you might want to have as a colleague. So I think that what we came to realise is that disclosure is very complex. It's not an either or, and it's not a one-off. But the staff perspective is just as interesting. For the staff, it was perceived as the right thing for students to do. And staff thought, and I guess there's a quote from one of our counsellors, I think it's a student's right not to disclose, but I think it would be good for them too. It sets up the framework for success. So the interesting thing was there, most of the staff perceived that students would benefit from disclosure, that they would benefit from the supports put in place. That wasn't the student experience. The students found that many of the supports were more suited to students with a learning disability or a physical disability rather than students with a mental health issue. The other thing that was most interesting to us was, of course, I had to ask the question of the staff. And the question I asked them was, if you had a mental illness, would you disclose in this environment? Resounding no. Not a single one said yes. And again, in exploring that with them, what they had all seen was head teachers lose responsibility after disclosure. They'd seen sessional staff suddenly no longer needed after a disclosure. So what they, so again, looking at, when we go back to the literature, there's a terrific paper written by these people that I refer to, and they suggest that staff disclosure decisions are unconsciously embedded in and shaped by an institutional discourse on what it means to be a good worker. I think we saw that, and certainly as many of the staff said to me, have a look around. How many disabled staff do you see? So again, conflicting. Now, Sue, I forgot my timing.
What about 15 minutes?
How many?
About
Right.
15.
So again, that conflict, and I think that the other interesting aspect of that staff reluctance to disclose was kind of an unawareness that there was a paradox there, that they were expecting students to do what they were themselves unwilling to do, and then I think that encourages us to look and see what's happening in the system that is reinforcing this set of beliefs. So again, thinking about context here, and what we could see is that there were really clear institutional processes that impacted upon both of those things, success factors and disclosure beliefs. Of course, we have a Disability Discrimination Act that guides our policies in VET, and that is grounded in a medical model of disability, not a social model. So again, as we all know, the way we construct a problem will determine how we intervene, how we define, and how we choose to act. What we saw is that for both staff and students, the issue around disclosure was around risk management. So for students, disclosure was around managing risk to self, in not disclosing, in choosing to disclose, taking a punt that might make a difference, and an academic failure may be averted. No guarantee though, and they certainly didn't find that. The unclear processes were that really stood out. On the enrolment forms at each one of the institutes, there was no mention of what would happen to the information. No mention of confidentiality, no mention about why we're asking. So students made an assumption that VET institutes asked for information about disability so they could do something about it. Teaching staff made an assumption that VET institutes asked for that information so that the teaching staff could be informed. No. The specialist staff knew that just because you ticked a box didn't mean anything happened. And that was the language they used. They said things like, people think that if you disclose a disability that someone will contact you and that something will be done. But she said that doesn't work that way. The onus is on the student. That's not always clear from the institutional documentation. And as one student said to me, it's like reading a phone book, but there's only first names. I have no idea who to go to for what. So unclear processes were really very important there. And I recall one student saying that, you know, if institutes ask for this information about us, they need to have a really clear sense of why they're asking and what they're going to do with this information. And the suggestion from many of the staff was that we're asking so that we can demonstrate that we're complying, that we're meeting our target groups. And the fear expressed by staff in the private sector was, we ask, but we don't have any services. So we ask because we have to, but what happens then if somebody wants something? So that's a very interesting study. And again, it has provided a springboard for us for some other work that we've been doing. And I'll just, again, hopping on the Women's Weekly Discovery Tour now, just very briefly take you to this scoping review of the literature that we've just done on facilitating post-secondary education for students experiencing mental illness or acquired brain injury. And I'm not sure if I explained properly why we've put those two groups together, but it is about often the non-apparent nature of the condition and also the age of onset. Again, if we think about the typical young person with an acquired brain injury, it is around that 18 to 24 age group as well. So what we were interested in is what interventions have been used? What are people doing to facilitate participation for these groups, and what types of outcome variables? Now, we chose a scoping review method there because while there's a fair bit of literature, it's so diverse, and the methodology is so diverse, it's not possible to compare like with like. So we thought we need to just go and see what exists, and then we can begin the process of making some, perhaps some deeper analysis of that. So briefly, we looked at, we did a systematic search of 18 databases. Once as a team, we determined our search terms, and again, acknowledging the limitations here, but we did only include studies published in English and between the years of 1990 and 2012. And the reason we chose 1990 was because it's a significant year in that it marked the introduction of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that saw a massive change in access to education for students with disabilities. So we found 669 abstracts. You can see that the majority of those were with focusing on students with mental illness. And then we scanned them and we ended up retaining only 41 that were relevant for inclusion in the review. And I've tricked you here by putting one of our first findings in the method. So again, what we did find was that those 41 papers were characterised by wide variations in methodological approaches and the interventions they provided and outcome measures. And that was the first thing we noticed, that our suspicions were correct. We were not able to compare like with like. So we ended up coming up with 7 primary categories of intervention. And again, of interest to you, I hope, is that the most reported interventions focus at the level of the individual. So again, we're taking a deficit approach in a sense. We keep looking to see how we can adapt this individual to our system. And what we're suggesting is that the system needs to have a look at itself too and think, what can the system do that will allow it to be more inclusive and embracing of a wider group of students? So again, the language used was individual support, specialised support delivered by specialists designed to compensate for. And again, just coming back to kind of a favourite of mine, is that those interventions are usually dependent upon disclosure. So we're relying on people being self-advocates in the classroom. And we know from our own experiences that very often the time that we most need assistance is the time we're least able to seek it. The time when our resources are most depleted, it's very difficult for us to navigate complex systems, and yet our well-intended educational sector relies on people being able to do that, to navigate when they're least likely. Interestingly, 8 of the 41 didn't report any outcomes at all. So again, thinking about what kind of outcomes matter, but we did then come up with 10 distinct outcome domains, and student views of themselves was the most common. So again, an individualistic approach. The next study, I should interrupt. Is there any questions so far on? Because I am conscious that I'm going like a speeding train, which means it's not V-line. Should I keep going? So the current study that Lisa and I and other colleagues are working on is taking this to the next step and looking at what are the individualised reasonable adjustments provided to tertiary students disclosing disability or ill health. So we've broadened it out again now, just from mental health issues and ABI, and what kinds of inclusively designed learning supports are perceived as useful for these students without the need for disclosure. So we're just shifting it a little bit. And again, this comes out of our earlier work where we found that students express dissatisfaction with the reasonable adjustments provided. We found, again, as much previous research has also found, that staff were unsure about the efficacy of some of the adjustments and even how to do it. And as you're all extremely aware, the vet sector is a highly casualised workforce, and most of the teaching is done by sessional teachers who fly in and fly out, and who will often describe their workplaces as isolated and fragmented. And so you have a vulnerable group of staff, in a sense, navigating services for a vulnerable group of students. That's not our intention, but that is often how it plays out. And I was thinking that one of the things that staff very often identify that they don't have, and Jonathan talked about earlier, is that they don't have time or opportunity to develop relationships with their students or even their colleagues. And relationship is critical often in well, certainly if people are going to seek assistance from us and perhaps make a disclosure, the relationship matters. So the questions we're asking, there we are, we're moving out of vet and into the university sector as well. Yes, Sue, 2 minutes. So these are our questions. So what's happening now at the individual level? What system level inclusively designed learning supports are being implemented? And what are people saying are most useful? Now, we're early into this study where we're recruiting tertiary students from Victorian University and a vet institute in northern metropolitan Melbourne. We've got 20 staff and up to 30 students. And at the moment, we are engaged in our individual interviews with students and our disability support staff. So that's where we are now. So just very briefly, we've done 8 interviews. Interestingly, we've had some students choose not to have their interviews recorded. And but we're yielding wonderfully rich data, and we get very excited about it, Lisa and I. So our preliminary data analysis suggests that both groups, both our disability staff and our students, describe the selection of reasonable adjustments as largely student-driven. But here's an interesting thing. Staff see that as great. Students see that as a burden. So staff say, this is empowerment. See, the students can tell us what they need. The students say, but I don't know what's on offer. I don't know what's possible. So again, the different perspective is interesting for us. Again, disability staff rely on the rapport they've built with faculty staff to implement adjustments for students. So relationship, again, is key. Often interpersonal support is a commonly used reasonable adjustment. Mixed feelings about that from staff and students too. Students actually like support outside of the sector. Think of that importance of quarantining life domains, of having a domain in which one is perceived as capable and competent, especially in the vet industry, where I'm probably being taught by the person who might employ me tomorrow. And always people believe that training is necessary. Just a closing words, I think that to come back to our thoughts about disclosure, that staff preference for student disclosure is influenced by the policy and practice constraints within which they work. They can't do much without it. They just can't. The resources are not there. Their professional background influences their views, and their personal experience of mental illness impacts upon their decisions also and their beliefs. So what we suggest is that while ostensibly well-intentioned, we often don't take sufficient account of the social complexities of student disclosure decisions, and the need to be defined by a category of difference in order to receive the mandated adjustments can create a separate but equal mentality. Again, we often place the onus on the student to adjust to the learning environment. So I think what we keep learning is that there is much to learn, and that it's a complex picture, and it is a sector characterised by good intentions. And our challenge now is to say, how can we shift perhaps the way our resources are allocated in the sector to just be more inclusive? We're not naive enough to think that there will be a sudden influx of resources. So it is a shifting and perhaps just a slight move to the left sometimes. So thank you.
Thanks, Anne. We've probably got time for one question. Anybody?
I was just wondering if your research did throw up any inclusive practices.
Yes, it did. And you know, some of these things are very simple. Some of the inclusive practices are things like SMS reminders to students about assessment dates for tasks, general reminders to students about processes for applying for extensions, the things that when we get anxious we forget how to navigate, presenting material in a number of ways, so putting material online for students as well as face-to-face, having that up in a timely manner or before the class makes a difference for students. Enabling, look, you know, they're simple things, but they kept coming up time and time again for students, just having access. The thing, of course, that students dearly love is clear instructions, and often as educators we think our instructions are clear, but they're not perhaps they're not always as clear as students would like them to be. So clear, timely feedback, material presented in a number of ways. The other thing that students did suggest they're interested in is people noticing and not being fearful of approaching. So when we were looking at it, we found that there were three key things that indicated that a student might be losing his or her way, and it was a change in attendance, a change in accountability, and by accountability we were thinking about their capacity to submit work in a timely manner. And my goodness, I've forgotten the other one. Isn't that interesting? But I will think of that. But certainly a welcoming an approach. The other thing students did say to us is, if you ask me, can I help, and I say no, please don't give up. Because if you ask me once, I will say no, because I think that you're just saying it because it's part of your job. And I'll also be essentially optimistic and think that I can manage. If you ask me again, I might be able to take that offer up, but if you ask me a third time, I'll know you're for real. So I thought multiple opportunities rather than that one-off offer that we often make to students. Let me know if you need some help. So finding ways to always extending the hand, I think, is a critical thing there.
Thanks, Amy.
Thank you.
So you've got a few minutes now to move to your next session, unless you're in this room for Dr. Mike Dockery.